There you go.
Cool. Are you throwing up cards or okay?
I'll time you and I'll wave at you.
Great. I'm also going to time us so I know because I can chat for a good long time. Okay. Sorry. Getting ready. All right, it's going. Okay. Hi everybody. Today, Marg and I will be talking about two 17th century items that have been conserved by the studio at the Royal School of Needlework. These two items are a 1629 Bible cover and a 1672 beadwork casket. Marg will talk about the process of conservation and restoration, while I talk about how I would go about researching these items in order to understand who made them and used them. And we'll each spend 5 minutes talking about the two objects, so it'll be a bit of like a back and forth thing. So I will get started. This is the first object, and this is a Bible cover for a Bible that was printed in 1629 by Bonham Norton and John Bill. And it's clear that the Bible cover was made for the Bible itself, that it's contemporary with this. It's obviously the right size, but the embroidery is also very much in keeping with professional embroidery from the period circa 1625 to 1640. And I'm going to walk you through my process when I look at a piece of historic embroidery in order to understand or try to get at who would have made this object, who would have used it, what was the world in which this object lived. That's the kind of work that I'm really interested in. And I theorize, based on my kind of pre-existing knowledge of historic embroidery and embroidery in this period, that this would have been the work of a professional workshop rather than somebody in the home or at a school, and it's due to three factors. First, it's the amount of metal thread. This whole thing is covered in metal thread, even the ground. You can't see any of the fabric ground. There is really naturalistic three-dimensionality in the form of stump work or raised work. And the Bible cover has these, can I use this? Yeah. These kind of like interesting strap work arabesque forms. All of these features are really typical of professional embroidery in England pre-English Civil War. And so I also just need to say, actually, before I go any further, that as I think everybody in this room can relate to, studying an object in real life versus studying it in photos are two very different experiences. I've never seen either of these objects in real life before, and I feel it's probable that if I were to look at them in real life, I would be reaching slightly different conclusions than I am reaching studying these objects through photos. Okay, so I think about this object, I think about my theories and what I already know about embroidery in this period, and then I compare it to other objects. I want to get at what was the aesthetic world of embroidery in this period in 1629. I start thinking about other professional embroidered pieces that I know of, such as this embroidered picture at the Holborn that shows Orpheus charming the animals. And even though it's a very different subject matter, I see similarities. I see this kind of interesting arabesque work. I see these naturally rendered three-dimensional forms. I see a lot of metal thread. But it's not that helpful for me to study objects that have a different use, even though they have a lot of the same material techniques. So I think about the fact that there are quite a few embroidered Bible covers from this period that survive, and the Bible cover that the RSM studio restored is really in keeping with these objects. The RSM studio Bible cover even has these same silk-wrapped pearl flowers that you see here, and they're really little, but they're here as well, all these pink and red ones. And I think about what I know and what I've read about these Bible covers. Some of them have known provenance information, and those that do tell us that these Bible covers were primarily made for people who, well, it was a lot for the Queen. Queen Elizabeth got a lot of them. And it was members of the aristocracy, people who could afford not only to decorate their Bibles, but to not damage these precious metal thread covers. They weren't handling them frequently. They were able to read their Bible. You can tell that it's kind of a specific echelon of people who were engaging with these materials. And provenance information tells us that these Bible covers were primarily made by members of the Worshipful Company of Broderers to cover Bibles that were printed by the Worshipful Company of Stationers. So it is then my theory that this object, the embroidery itself, would have been rendered by somebody either who was a guild member or who was associated with it. This was a professional workshop. Professional workshops were populated at this time by men and women. Hard to say if it was a man or a woman who did this, but this is a professional who was making embroidery for sale rather than for simply pleasure. And then the one other thing that I think about with this Bible cover is that bird, the bird with its wings out. Birds appear a lot in embroidery in this period, in the early 17th century, and oftentimes the bird motif is on materials that it's hard to tell if they're made in England or made in the Netherlands. There's a lot of overlap. So both of these gloves in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art have been identified as Dutch or English. You can see a very similar rendering of the birds, even though these birds don't have wings out in the world. The way that they have been rendered and the actual physical elements of them, their beaks, their eyes, are really similar. And in this period, professional embroiderers in England had much influence from the Netherlands. You had lots of immigration from that area, people moving from the Low Countries into England to work professionally as embroiderers. So it is my feeling that because of the imagery and the other professional elements present on the embroidered Bible cover, that this is the work of somebody who has connections to the Netherlands. So I have taken my theory and I've kind of looked at other objects to fill out this picture. And even though I'll never know for certain who made this object, I feel that I can point to an answer, and that maker is likely somebody who is a professional, possibly part of a guild, who had connections to the Netherlands, and who was able to sell goods rather than make them simply in the home for pleasure. Okay.
Thank you. Morning, everybody. Right, so I'm going to be talking about the conservation and restoration of both objects. Firstly, I'd just like to say that both of these objects are in private hands, so they belong, they're family pieces, so they are not in a museum, even though they're museum sort of standard, they are owned privately. So they've been documented and photographed, so everything that I did was photographed, but also it's removable. So going forward, everything that I added to it can be taken off. Okay. So on the left side, where is that? Oh, there we are. So here we are. So this is one of the leaves that I created to go back onto the Bible cover. It was quite a challenge to actually get a thread that would match the tarnished threads on the cover. Obviously I had to use new threads. I couldn't use old threads. It had to be strong and had to be used and doing quite complex stitches. So I used a corded detached buttonhole, and actually Jackie Carey's book on Elizabethan stitches was invaluable. So it was firstly quite time to get the right stitch. And I've used, around the outside you can probably see it quite clearly, I've used a silver Japanese type thread, which has got a black silk core. So actually the black silk made it kind of disappear quite well into the Bible cover. And I've done that for the corded buttonhole stitch. I've also used a cotton as well on there. And on the right hand side is actually an original leaf that had the lizarine loose around the outside. And I think you can tell that actually it's not a bad match to one of the original leaves. So I was quite pleased that I managed to kind of match it. So I'm just stitching the lizarine that's loose back on to the original leaf. This is a little bit harder to see, so I do apologise. So here, that is one of the leaves that I did remake. And I've got pins there holding it onto the padding. So there was felt wool padding underneath some of the leaves, which gave it the raised look. The background is completely covered in embroidery, and that was pasted to the cover, so I was not able to stitch into the cover at all. It's actually, the leaf is held onto the padding. And just there, you can see some of the threads that I've remade the leaf with. I left loose, therefore I could use those threads to reattach it to the padding. I don't want to start new threads, they were strong enough to be used, and that was completely reattached. So actually the challenge with this was to find threads that matched the original cover, and I think it's worked quite well. Obviously we can't use threads from that time, so it's a matter of making my own threads and using what's available now to fit in with that. Right. Next object. So this is amazing. So here we are. We've got a beaded casket, and Isabella's going to talk a little bit about the history. But this is kind of every face of it. So we've got the four sides and the lid, and it's stunning. It's just beautiful. And this is a family piece. It was owned by the client's grandmother. So she's seen it all her life. Now, sadly, it had quite a lot of damage on the front of it, which is understandable. That's the bit that is used quite a lot. So firstly, I want to talk about the humour. So it's a little bit hard to see. I do apologise again because I wanted to get every slide in. So just over here, very little, we can see we've got a little cat and an even smaller little mouse. So we've got a cat and a mouse there, quite unusual. It's usually dogs on there. And I'm just going to pop right up here. Again, a little bit hard to see. We've got a caterpillar eating a flower. Now, there's usually quite a lot of caterpillars and insects used on these kind of things, splattered against the background, hanging in the air, just floating around. This one is actually eating a plant. And because of the damage by moths, it actually looks like it has eaten it. So it's kind of like this amazing kind of, do you really want to prepare something like that? Because this caterpillar is eaten away. So there we are. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about, so this, when I conserved it, this was almost like a little study in 17th century beads, because almost everything here, a few tiny bits, but mostly it's just full of embroidery. So obviously there's silver braid on the outside, but it was a bead study. So we've got opaque beads, which are in the tinted area. So they're just solid beads, absolutely amazing, do not lose their colour. So I just want to say that actually looking at this piece is how it probably was seen mostly in the 17th century. It has not lost its colour because of the glass beads. We have got, somewhere on here, we've got striped beads. So they were hand-painted beads. So they were kind of a white pearlescent bead that were not rolled out and cut into cones. They were actually painted individually, which I found quite amazing. Transparent beads. So the clothing on the two figures, these were fantastic. So again, a little bit hard to see, but the clothing is actually different tones of brown. You can probably see it a little bit more on her garment. So it gives a shaded effect. So really subtle differences, and each row was a slightly different colour. We have marbled beads, which I think we can just about see there. So they were all different because they looked like they'd had a marbled effect, which I had not seen before, so that was great. And also there were beads that looked like they had had a coating on the inside, and they were used on the strawberry plants and the thistle. So possibly the coating had degraded, and that was used maybe to get a red colour. Red beads, very expensive. So possibly something on the inside to give the red effect. Right, so this is the poor unicorn before being clothed again. So I just want to talk about some of the things that as a maker I'm able to kind of see from this slide. So firstly, these kind of odd bundles you can see here of blue silk. They were just placed on top of the wool padding. No reason for them to be there in terms of trying to pad it up anymore. So I feel because the unicorn was actually made of clear, transparent beads, a few left on here, very difficult to see, I wonder if the maker had actually decided to try and shade the unicorn by bundling up blue beads to show a bit of shading through. So whereas the clothing had its own shades, this was clear. So I think maybe she was trying to be a little bit inventive to try and kind of give a little bit of shading to the unicorn. So on the head here, we can see just these kind of straight stitches. And I found this really interesting because this was the only way of attaching the padding. So I always thought that the padding would have lots of stitches holding it down, making it secure. But in this case, the padding was all very loose and bulging, and it was only secured by a few stitches on the bottom. So it bulged out. In contrast, on the ear and the horn, there's loads of little needle holes. And that's where the flat beads would be, and they were stitched through the whole slip. So it's kind of like a way to work out how they constructed everything there. Right, so how did I go about making the new slip? Well, I attached polythene, as you can see here, just to the padding. So obviously I don't want to be touching the beads too much. I didn't want to be kind of, having to do too much intervention on the actual casket. So I wanted to be able to remake the slip without having to touch too much. So I drew around with pins, drew around there, you can see, so that I would get a little pattern all around. Transferred that to paper, which you can see on the right hand slide. So that was basically my template to make rewoven slips. The original beads, they were dropping off the whole time from the unicorn, and obviously they needed to be removed because they were all loose. So they're in the bag, and actually was able to almost identically match, which is quite fantastic, to Victorian glass beads. So it wasn't a case, obviously you can't go out and just replicate or get 17th century beads. We're able to have them, luckily, in our treasure drawers of beads that we have at the RSN, and match them almost identical. So that was very good. I'm not sure what we'd have done otherwise. Right, so here I am. This is the unicorn's head. You can see I've just rewoven the eye there. And actually you can see I was able to utilise one of the hand-painted beads. I just realised you can see that quite clearly. This is one of the hand-painted ones, so it's white with a little blue stripe that I found inside the casket. So I used that for the eye. And I'm using a flat peyote stitch and a number 15 bead needle. So even though the beads themselves are quite large, the actual hole of the bead was very small. So this is the finest needle that I could use on that one. So here we are. The body, and I think, yes, I've already, so the body here is being attached, and I'm attaching it just to the padding. This flat silk you can see in the background is completely glued to the casket. So even though there are some little kind of air gaps, it's very fragile and it was not able to be stitched into, and I couldn't really, you don't want to do that anyway. So I was just stitching basically into the padding that you see here with a really fine needle. Next one, right. So casket front done. I also did a new slip for this animal. Let's call it a sheep, goat, not really sure. The horn and the body of the unicorn all done there. And the client, although we'd normally maybe net these things, use conservation net, we would not recommend putting restoration on something like this. The client was going to get it done regardless. So she was extremely happy to have animals back. This is the front. So this is what she looked at in her own drawing room. And I just want to point out the caterpillar now, sadly, his little flower is back in place.
An additional snack.
Yeah, it's back. So yeah.
Dinner part 2.
Exactly. So Isabella.
Thanks. Okay. So I just want to say that one of the things I love about Marg's, material-based method when engaging with this stuff is you're really able to see the girl's personality. So I will talk about how I know that this is the work of a schoolgirl, but I think it's so special that we can see through the process of remaking that this girl used these little blue bundles. Didn't work out super effectively, but she sure tried. And I think that's such an ingenious idea, and that there's this humor. I think that we forget that people in the 17th century, the people that we study all the time, they were fully fledged people. They had likes, dislikes, complexities. These were girls who had humor and a sense of whimsy and a sense of fun. And I think that this casket exemplifies that, and also shows us just how vibrant the past was. They weren't living in sepia tones or pastels. They were living in bright, vibrant color. So the work that I do, I tend to take objects and use their materiality in order to understand, or work to understand, who would have made them, right? I said that before. And so I look at this object and I want to know who would have made this, what was the context in which they would have made this object. And I theorize, and I should say that, I theorize. There's no way to know for certain, but I theorize that this is the work of a schoolgirl, a girl nearing the end of her needlework education, rather than a woman in the home or a professional bead worker. And I'll talk in a second about why I think that. There are a few reasons, but basically, in the second half of the 17th century, some well-off schoolgirls were encouraged to engage with beads, to make beadwork baskets, caskets, panels, mirror surrounds, all sorts of domestic furnishings. These beads were coming out of Venice and Amsterdam starting around the 1620s, and by the time this casket was made in 1672, they were all the rage. To work with beads as a girl suggested that you had a certain level of wealth and investment in your education, and that your family, your teacher, somebody was interested in fashionable worldly goods, because these beads had simply not been around for that long, and they were in this period being used in increasingly new and inventive ways. The reason I think that this is the work of a schoolgirl is partially because the object is initialed and dated. The initials are I or JD and the year 1672, and professional embroiderers don't, in this period, tend to initial or date their objects in England. And I also think that there is a beautiful element of schoolgirl or non-professional embroidery work in the underdrawing, the stuff that Marg got to see as she was working with the object. So you can see the little, goat, sheep, dog thing over here. Yep. And in the unicorn's horn and ear, you can see this kind of rudimentary, basic underdrawing. Not a lot of shading, not a lot of detail going on. So compare it to the unfinished casket panels in the collection of the Met. You can see that there's a difference in terms of who is drawing this stuff, who is creating it at its foundational level. And I believe that this is the work of either a schoolgirl or a teacher. It's not a professional. And it feels that in every step of this process of making the casket, it's the work of non-professional embroiderers, it's the work of women, it's the work of people outside of a workshop. They aren't going to a shop in London to purchase these, they're doing it themselves. And the reason I also feel like this is the work of a schoolgirl rather than a professional is, in the world of 17th century beadwork, there are a few different looks, and this one matches the look of those that were made as part of an education. So a similar box is here from Colonial Williamsburg. You can see that there's a similar use of the beads, these kind of straight lines, this flat peyote stitch, and there's also a little wiggly black outlines. It's more about imagery than specifically expert shading. This object on the right here, which is on display at the V&A, is a basket that was made by Sarah Gurnall, and we know that she was a teenager. This is part of a group of at least 6 panels and baskets made by Ipswich teenagers. One can assume, I'm working on it, trying to find records of the school they went to, but these were girls who were doing this in a classroom setting rather than a professional workshop setting. Compare these to professional beadwork pictures. On the left here you have this beadwork box that's in the burl, and you can see this really expert and very large scale. It's big, this box, this really intricately worked beadwork coat of arms. On the right, you have these 3-dimensional forms, these 3D fruits. You have this really, this emphasis on naturalistic shading. There's a difference between the professional and the non-professional beadwork at this time, and the casket seems to fall within the non-professional stuff. It's about imagery, it's about color and fun. It's not about the most naturalistic shading or showing off your family's wealth through things like coats of arms. So my feeling, my theory, my conclusion is that this is the work of a girl as part of her education. She had access to fine and very fashionable materials, and she had a sense of humor, which I think is the best part of all. So in conclusion, I'll say from both of us that researchers and makers go through different processes, obviously, to reach conclusions about the objects they study and handle, but both of those journeys lead to further information about an object's materials, process of production, maker, and user. Whereas Marg is learning how these people were working with these materials. My work, my iconographical connoisseurial work, is more about how they were using those materials to show themselves as a reflection of their own process, I guess. And through these processes, we can understand how to interpret past objects in the present and make them more accessible. And as we all know here today, researchers and makers need to work together as we both have pockets of specialized knowledge. That feels like this is the perfect place to say that conclusion. The best conclusions come when people who make and people who study the making can get together. Thanks. Wait, we sit down now, right? Questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Isabella and Marg. That was wonderful. Just going to get the next presentation up, which is Veronica. So our next speakers are Veronica Isaac and Rebecca Morrison, who will be talking about taking theatrical license, can collaboration and creativity overcome the potential pitfalls of recreative practice. Veronica Isaac is Senior Lecturer at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences of the University of Brighton, and actually has a new second job. Do you want to?
So I'm a subject leader for the new MA costume course at Wimbledon College of Arts.
Now I'll continue with the She is currently writing a new biography of actress Ellen Terry and specialises in the history and material culture of 19th and 20th century dress and costume. Rebecca Morrison recently completed her PhD at the V&A and Queen Mary University of London. Her thesis focused on the lives and business practices of English mantua makers, one of the most significant fashion trades of the long 18th century. She also incorporates practice-led research elements into her work, and Ellen Terry's image and costume is her first foray into 19th century costume. So over to Veronica and Rebecca.
Thank you. Okay, so it's a two-hander again, and beautifully set up by the previous presentation. We may echo some of their comments. So my job here is to give you a bit of the background to the project and how a team of people, of which we are just two, came together. So I'll tell you a little bit about how it came together, what inspired it, some of the people who are working on it or have worked on it, where we are now. We're close, but not quite at the end. We'll touch on the discoveries that have resulted, and we'll end by trying to convince you of the specific significance of recreating costume for performers, because we're a bit of a sideways move in the Making Historical Dress event, but we hope a good one. So I won't give you too much detail about Ellen Terry. Anyone who's heard me speak before is like, oh no, not again. But for those of you who aren't familiar with her and why we chose to recreate her costume specifically, she's one of the leading performers of the 19th century, and what set her apart from her fellows was the level of control she had over the costume she wore on the stage, how much she wrote about it, and how much of her costume survives. So this whole recreative project is inspired by a surviving costume. And one of her later roles, when she took on this role, she was in the later stage of her career, as I'll discuss. What we also know about Ellen Terry, which is rare, is the woman who designed her costumes, Alice Commons Carr. She thoughtfully left us no letters, I cannot find them, but a wonderful biography which you have to take with a pinch of salt, but which is full of great anecdotes about creating costumes with Ellen Terry and the other people that they were brought together in the process. And even more rarely, we know who made them, or at least who led the team of makers that worked on them, which is Ada Nettleship. She was a really important dressmaker, costumier, designer, well, semi-designer of this period, had a huge workshop on Wigmore Street, a whole team of girls who worked for her, and was brought into contact with Ellen Terry by Alice Commons Carr, but had already made a few famous people's gowns, including the wedding dress for Constance Wilde. She was fairly well established when she came to the team. What set her apart as a maker was a pre-existing interest in making aesthetic dress, as was the case with Alice Commons Carr, who also wore aesthetic dress, and Ellen Terry was known for loving aesthetic dress. So three women, like-minded, committed to collaborating on creating some really original and spectacular gowns, of which this was one. This one is set apart from some of Ellen Terry's other costumes in that this production was a collaboration with the artist, Lawrence Alma Tadema, who was known for creating brilliant classical paintings, and the production of Cymbeline is set in the sort of faux Roman Greco-classical world, and it was sort of recreating his canvases on the stage. And my hypothesis in this instance, knowing how she worked with Ben Jones and some of the anecdotes that survive about her work with Alma Tadema, is that what would have happened is that Alma Tadema would have produced either some sketches or shown her some of his paintings already created and said, this is kind of what I have in mind for Ellen Terry for the role. He definitely had some very strong opinions about the silhouette of this dress, which we may or may not touch on, depending on how much we have time for. But he knew the silhouette he wanted to create. He definitely would have given her a sort of colour palette to work with. But Alice Commons Carr's position would have been almost this sort of translator or mediator between Alma Tadema's design, quite a strong-minded performer in terms of Ellen Terry, who had, clear views about what worked for her body. And by this point, she is 49, and she is getting bigger. She didn't like to diet. She writes in her letters that she loved cake. That was her problem. She says that she doesn't like wearing corsetry, and she definitely steered away from strong underpinnings where she could. Where a production demanded it, you could force her into some stays or a strong corset, but if she could avoid it or have some other kind of underpinning, like in the Beetle-wing dress, she has sort of a knitted silk jersey Spanx effect bodice underneath. That was her preference. But she was very aware of her changing body and wanted something that would flatter her. Also, what's going on in her private life at this point is that her relationship with her actor manager, Sir Henry Irving, which has been very passionate and ongoing for over a decade, is coming to an end. So she's feeling pretty insecure about how she looks on stage. She's aware the public are coming to see a youthful performer and she is not youthful anymore. And she wants to look good, and I don't think that's unfair. So together, Ada Nettleship, Alice Commons-Carr, Ellen Terry and Alma Tadema produced this, and she's really happy with it and feels that it's one of the loveliest dresses that she ever wore, and I think that's part of the reason it survives. A small hide where she kept it. So why did I want to recreate it, and who did I bring together to do so? We wanted to recreate it because although the original survives, it is, not to be overdramatic, dying. That is the technical term. It is falling apart. It can never be mounted on the stand again. It's too fragile, and if we don't capture what survives now, it will vanish forever. So I came together with experts from the National Trust, they're listed here, with a team of specialist dress and textile conservators, Zenzi Tinker Conservation Limited, more on the next slide, who've been working with the collection for nearly 2 decades. Janet Wood, who is in the audience, and we may call on later if there are questions that come up. Rebecca, and myself. And I was the researcher with the sort of evidence, the documentary evidence, but literally no making talent, as you'll see in workshops later. And I knew I needed conservation knowledge to understand how to work with the object, how to support it safely, recreation knowledge in terms of creating a toile, which Janet brought to the table, a maker who was ideally a costumier, who understood how to make for the stage, and to get them all working on the same object to keep it alive in a different form. So, as I said, Zenzi and her team have been working with Terry's costumes for over 20 years, and through this, they've really come to understand her body and how it fluctuated over time and shifted. They've really also come to know how you mount costume so that it looks alive and doesn't look really tired or really sad, and it has that movement to it. And they've learned patterns in the way their costumes are constructed. They've learned to see the hands in the stitches. They can differentiate between a conservator who's worked on them before they got to them. They've learned about the alterations that have happened over the course of their history. It's not just been Ellen Terry's body inside these garments. And they've also learned about patterns in the kind of material she liked and the finishes that she liked. So they're really helpful. They can help me read these garments. They also have discovered ways of conserving these garments that have helped us with the recreation process, because they worked on the Beetle-wing dress and had to replicate elements that were missing from the belt. So when they saw the metal elements of the original costume, they said, we have a process through which we can recreate these. And it's Jamie Robinson, who's a member of the team who worked on them. If you follow Zenzi Tinker on Instagram, you may have seen some of these images already. If not, follow after this and see them in more depth. But she literally cast in resin the metal elements and then learned how to solder for this project so she could recreate the necklace that goes around the neckline of the dress. And we have the finished results here. On the left-hand side, you have the recreations. On the right-hand side, you have the originals. We will keep them separate and mark them so we can tell which are which, because it's almost indistinguishable. And I could never have done any of this, nor would I have thought to do so. And then Janet, oh my gosh, Janet, I gave you the most horrible job. This is when an ignorant person goes, can you just map a surviving garment for me and create a toile? And they go, oh, okay. So Janet has a background in fashion and a specialist knowledge of construction and pattern drafting. She has recreated toiles of many garments before and worked with numerous historic institutions. This may be one of the hardest things she's ever had to work with, because she had to develop a process for mapping the dress. And it took us a long time, I say us, her, a long time to work out even what materials to put over the top of the dress to try and trace the pattern pieces. And through that recreative process, she realised that this wasn't a pattern that had been drafted, it had been draped on the body. There is no way you would draft this pattern and then put it on a form. It has no logic to it. Rebecca will talk about how many pieces there are. So in order to create the next stage and the pattern for Rebecca to work from, Janet realised she'd have to create a toile. and worked incredibly hard to do so. And this trial is really helpful because this is only one recreation of the project, of the costume. This is our blueprint for other people who might come along with more time, more money, different methodologies. So this is our blueprint for anyone else who wants to recreate it, and a map of the costume, because that's also what I wanted to achieve for the to preserve the original. And this is what Rebecca was given, and I handed it over. Well, Janet handed it over to her, and I will now hand the presentation over to Rebecca as well to talk about what came next.
Thank you. So yeah, Janet handed it over to me with the sort of words of, I think this is the hardest pattern I've ever had to take. I think that was correct. And so I'm going to go through the challenges that that both Janet and I, in our ways, have been facing, and then more specifically the things that I've been doing on this project. I won't go over this slide too much because I'll discuss all of these in a bit more detail. But the first one I'll talk about a little bit is degrees of separation. So Zenzi's team and Janet have spent a fair amount of time with the dress in Zenzi's conservation studio. I've seen it twice. The first time I hadn't got my head around it at all because it is a very complex costume. So it was really the second time that I engaged with it that I could understand what I was looking at. That's one of the biggest problems that I've had to deal with so far, I'll come back to that when I talk a bit about fabrics and colours because of that distance. Complexity, fabrics, going back to Marg's conversation about materials and what you can use for these sort of recreations, whereas alterations, we'll go through them all individually. So the challenges, so this for both Janet and myself, the biggest challenge is the complexity of this garment. I've sort of been joking that when I cut out what you can see on the right there is the underbodice on which the rest of the costume is mounted. So just to give you an idea, this costume at the moment has these layers. It has this linen underbodice. It has a sort of blousey piece, which isn't a full blouse because it just is attached to the bodice, and the sleeves and things are separate. It has these separate gauzy sleeves. It has a skirt, a gauzy skirt, which then has an overskirt, and then there's a sort of gold bolero, and we know that there's probably at least one other piece that's missing, which I'll talk about towards the end. And so the pattern pieces, the bodice on the right, the underbodice has 12 pieces, all that would have probably all been drafted. And when I put them out on a table, having spent 8 years in the 18th century, I was like, oh gosh, this isn't done by whips anymore. There's a lot of wastage here and a lot of curves. And then you look at the skirt, which has at least 17 pieces, which are all irregular shapes. And as Janet said, these were not drafted. These must have been draped on the body. And again, I will talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Here we are. So one of the great things, as Veronica was saying about this costume, is that there is so much documented evidence about who made it, who wore it, what they thought of the costume. And there's a fabulous article that was published in 1897 where Ada Nettleship talks about the making of the garment. And she says that there are 25 pieces of silk in the drapery, but I don't think we've found 25 pieces of silk in the drapery. So who knows where the other 8 have gone. Made in graduated gauze, and the gauze which encircle the waist being smaller and stretching out in a sort of umbrella effect, as I'm sure you saw in the last slide. And it's wrinkled about the waist and slightly about the hips. The silks are used are all changeable, so they're all shot. And melt into each other in such a cunning way that at first one gets the effect of one colour, but it gradually dawns upon you that the drapery is like an octave on the piano, the tones scarcely different from one another. Yet, in a moment, you have the vast difference of an octave. But then she also goes on to say that she took about 3 weeks doing nothing but the drapery. And she also told the reporter for the newspaper that she had a body double. So she employed a woman who was the same size and shape as Ellen Terry to wear the costumes in her workroom, presumably so that she could get a sense of how they looked in movement, how you could move within them if they were easy to perform in. She does complain that fantastic body double got married and quit. And then she had a challenge to find somebody else who was prepared to take on the job, and refused to try on anything that when Ellen Terry was doing breeches roles, she'd only wear dresses. So we have a bit of an insight into how it was made, but that doesn't really help us right now because the biggest challenge for me so far has been the fabrics. And this is always a discussion when it comes to recreation. there is no such thing as sort of an authentic material. It's gone. It's, you know, we don't have 19th century fabrics anymore. If we did, they'd probably be in a state where you couldn't work with them. And this costume has, as I said, a range of fabrics, starting with the linen bodice, which was the easiest to find a replica for. But as I said, the blouse, the sleeve, and the underskirt are all made of this sort of pale bluey grey gauze, which is almost like a bandage weave. It's nothing like a gauze that you'd get today, and it's a silk gauze, just to add complication. And then it has a printed floral pattern through it, and it's been crinkled. Then the draped overskirt, 17-18 panels of a shot silk twill. If anyone can find that for me, that would be amazing, but it's not out there anymore. In 10 different colour combinations, just to add to the trickiness. And then the bolero is a sort of cloth of gold. There's some metallic threads in there. They're not gold. They're a slightly more base metal. They have dulled probably over time. There's still a bit of a sheen to it, but when you look at the black and white photos of the era, it's not as shiny as it once was, but we don't really know what the colour was once upon a time. There's a little neck infill in a silk chiffon. That wasn't too tricky. And then there are trims in a silk taffeta on the sleeves, which are that goes underneath the gauzy bits. And again, that wasn't too tricky. But here you can see me swatching for the gold. In the end, there is not a natural fibre in the fabric we chose. It is a posh upholstery fabric meant for making curtains, but on this occasion, it's going to be turned into a 19th century bolero. So this brings me into to talk about compromises and the kind of compromises that we're having to make on this project. As I said, shot silk twill, impossible. So we found a white silk twill, which I'm currently dyeing in my kitchen. Actually, no, I have finished dyeing it in my kitchen to match the original weft threads. So we've had to sacrifice this idea of this beautiful changeable fabric that will change as the performer moves across the stage. The silk gauze is now cotton gauze, although we have found one which has got a printed floral pattern through it, which has been dipped, but because the fabric is a natural fibre and the print is not, it's now a lovely kind of grey-blue colour with a white floral pattern through it. So we'll see how it works. But we have found discoveries with original processes. As I said, I was dyeing in my kitchen thinking this isn't very professional of me. But then if you look back at the records, when it came to crinkling the silk gauze back in the day, they used a potato steamer. So we're not too far away from it. They were working in their kitchen. The common car used a potato steamer, twisting the stuff up into a ball and boiling it. So I got my 13-year-old daughter out in the garden helping me twist lengths of gauze up. And then I stuck it in a pan on my hob with a bit of vinegar. And then I left it to dry for a few days in the bathroom. I did have to move it any time anyone wanted a shower. So Veronica's touched a little bit on Terry's changing body. I'm not going to talk about this for too long, but again, looking at the dress, looking at the shape of the stand on which we're remaking it, you can see that there must have been a little bit of support going on, it sort of, again, it reveals things that perhaps, the materiality of it reveals things that perhaps people wouldn't have wanted written down in the day. Discoveries we've come across. We've got some alterations, because as Veronica said, Terry was probably not the only person to wear this. So we've got questions about who were the alterations for, were they for Terry, were they for a subsequent performer? It was used in amateur dramatic, possibly.
They used it, yeah, amateur. She'd lend them to other performers, and her daughter would lend them to other performers. They also used them in fundraising costume pageants to raise money for the property before it went to the National Trust. So they just grab them from the store and wear them to get the public to give a little bit more money in the basket. So yeah, many people may even have.
And also there's been earlier conservation work. So there's this sort of 20th century netting behind some of the pieces. So again, we don't know if areas have been unpicked and put back together. So there's lots of question marks about the alterations and the changes. As we were saying, potentially other wearers. Is Julia Arthur in this photo wearing the same costume, or is it a copy of Terry's costume? All opinions very welcome. We might take a vote on this later in the day. And then there are some questions remaining. So as I said, there's the gauzy underskirt, but it's now detached from the rest of the costume. Was it attached originally? There's some evidence perhaps that it was. There's a bit of blue at the bottom of the linen bodice, but we're not sure. There's also, if I use this here, you can see under the gauze that there would have been a petticoat of some kind. So we've still got to decide what that petticoat should look like, what it should be made of. And then the knot, which again was like Janet, I can see Janet. There's this sort of way it's ruched and bunched up at the side of the waist and closed. There are hooks and bars there, but on the toile it's been almost impossible so far to work out how that ruching and that bunching works. So that's something for me to play about with and try and work out. So I'm going to pass back to Veronica for the last 2 minutes.
Yeah, so we'll just conclude by thanking Rebecca and Janet for still working with me at this stage. And we thought we'd just highlight why performance costume is an interesting way to think about recreating historical dress and what sets these apart, but also parallels with fashionable dress. So when you're creating performance costume, you can really explore this relationship between garment, wearer, and character. It's created to facilitate the embodiment of a specific role. You're taking a real person and transporting them into a different persona. Sometimes they carry their actual persona across. That was often the case with Ellen Terry. Sometimes it's got to be really contrasting and they can't get into character till they have that costume functioning for them. So you've got a different, the garment's performing a different function, but you get more documentation about that. You get to think about the reviews of the performance, and you have an inkling of the kind of idea of the time and how they interpreted Roman dress in the 19th century. See on the slide. You get way more provenance in this case, not with every performance costume, but often those that survive have been preserved because they are associated with a specific designer or a performer. It's David Tennant's leather trousers, it's not just a pair of leather trousers, etc. And in this case, we've got the rare insight into the wearer, designer, and maker. And I really want to recapture makers where I can. It's an overtly designed object, as I've said, created with a specific purpose in mind, rather than fashionable dress, which might be a generic fashionable dress of the period. This is very specifically for the Lyceum Theatre's production of Cymbeline in 1896, designed by an artist of the time. And then the materiality of costume is different. Usually they're far more damaged than historic dress, although there is historic dress which can be very, very damaged. And yeah, there's going to be more sweat and they can be more smelly, but you know, the sweat brings the drama. And you have, so much is imprinted on these garments. Like I said, Zenzi's team are helping me to read multiple hands that have been on these costumes and multiple bodies as well. And what you see in that thread is the life story of the garment. And I would say also there's potential greater need for recreation of theatrical costume because of the condition you encounter it in. And you're having to recapture something that's very, very different to fashionable dress. These are meant to be seen from a distance under specific lighting, which kind of brings me to our final slide, which is the ambitions for the next step, if I can raise the cash.
And we can find a body.
And find a body. Anyone?
Good at Shakespeare.
Good at Shakespeare, no pressure. But I am working with someone who's a historian of theatrical technology to see if we can recreate gaslight and limelight so that we can get not just this costume, but potentially also the Beethoven dress, if I can persuade the National Trust, under the lighting that's meant to be seen under. So not what you saw it in the Sargent and Fashion exhibition, but in stage lighting. And we could bring the recreation and the originals to the stage and reanimate these garments in the way they deserve. So thank you so much for listening. Hopefully we've convinced you.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much. And I am very much looking forward to seeing the finished.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to see not 19th century fabric.
Okay, our next speaker is Laura Beltrán-Rubio, who is a curator, researcher, and educator specialising in Latin American and indigenous textiles and fashion. Her mission is to diversify global fashion by creating bridges between the industry and academia. She is my wonderful colleague and lecturer here in design cultures at DMU, and she is a senior researcher at the Fashion and Race Database. And Laura is going to be speaking about decolonising fashion from historical sewing.
Thank you, Serena. Hi everyone, thank you for being here. I'm very excited to share a little bit about these basically experiments in fashion education that I've been conducting in Colombia mostly, and mostly at the Colonial Museum in Bogota, which is this fantastic colonial house that you are seeing here. What I'm about to present is definitely inspired in the work that actually many of you do here, not just Serena and Sarah and other members of the Making Historical Dress Network, but it's, of course, an initial experiment. Or actually, I'm going to be presenting on 3 iterations of this experiment that I've been doing, and I know they are not here, but I also want to thank not just all of you for the inspiration, but Camille-Wood, who opened the doors of the Colonial Museum and especially the storage for me for the first time when I was a master's student many years ago. Jimena Guerrero, who has helped me organize several workshops at the Colonial Museum over the past few years, and Constanza Toquica, the museum's director, who's also been super, super helpful. And finally, Ana Maria Orobio and Dr. Olga Acosta from Universidad de los Andes. I'll tell you a little bit about their involvement in the project later. But they are basically my biggest allies. I call them my best fashion friends back in Colombia. And I've co-taught some of these workshops with them, and they've definitely informed a lot of these experiments that we've been doing. So with all dues paid, I want to introduce you to the term costurero histórico, which very roughly translates to a historical sewing circle or historical sewing group. And that's basically the name that I've given to a bunch of different group activities that bring together fashion history and sewing. And this is, I wrote here that it's my terminology because it's basically a name that I give to it. I don't think it's like a formal name. I haven't really seen or found information of other people talking about these kinds of costureros históricos. But, you know, it was kind of the name that I came up with. So again, what I want to share today are 3 different iterations of the costurero histórico, reflect about their importance for disseminating information and educating especially the general public in fashion history, and perhaps even their potential for decolonizing fashion history and fashion studies, especially in a Latin American setting. So I first came up with the term costurero histórico back in 2020. I was trapped in Virginia. I was just about to go back to Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico and Peru to do research for my PhD, but the pandemic hit. Colombia closed its borders for over a year, so I basically couldn't go back at all. So as I was in Virginia, I was trying to figure out how to keep going with my research, how to also stay connected with Latin America. That has always been a very important part of my practice as an educator and as a researcher. I want to, return there and also exchange knowledge and disseminate knowledge there, even though I've been based in English-speaking contexts for more than 10 years now. And the other thing that happened back then, other than being trapped in Virginia and trying to figure out how to pursue my research, even if I was there, was that for a couple of years I had been reconnecting with needlework. I was introduced to needlework when I was a little girl. Growing up with my grandmother, I learned to knit, to crochet, to sew, to embroider, like a bunch of different things. And I reconnected with them during the PhD, mostly as a hobby. But during those early months, especially of the pandemic, I started speaking more with some friends, and I actually have a very close group of my childhood friends who are also researchers. They also got their PhDs in different disciplines. But I think starting with the pandemic, we started these groups where we would get together every week and discuss our research to keep us going. And during one of those meetings, one of my friends suggested that I should teach them how to knit virtually, and that maybe we should also talk about fashion history. And I was like, this is a great idea. And so I started doing that. I opened it not just to my friend, but to other people. And by this time, I had a pretty large community through a digital humanities platform that I had designed for one of my classes in 2018 as the early coursework of the PhD. And through that community and through social media, I kind of brought a group of people together for that first costurero histórico. And these are actually some of the pieces that people made. They sent me all of these photos in that first costurero histórico. So what we did basically was that people were welcome to join. It was a Zoom meeting, as a lot of things were back in 2020. And so it had two parts. People could join if they knew any form of needlework and they could just bring their own projects and just work through them. Or they could try to learn new things. And actually I started with embroidery instead of knitting because I thought it was easier to teach that through a camera. And I also had an ally in Peru, one in Colombia and one in Ecuador, who prepared these kits, like very basic initial embroidery kits. And I recorded these videos for people to start learning how to make their first stitches. And they made these like little sampler with, again, some very basic stitches. And then they were welcome to apply them to different things. So some of them, well, this is one of the more advanced versions, but some of them just wrote simple phrases. Some of them embroidered their t-shirts, things that they had. So again, it was just a very basic exercise. And what we would do is that we would meet once a week. I started them, like batching them in group sessions of 4 sessions, like all together. So we would meet for 4 weeks, once a week. And we would discuss fashion history. So it was a very informal conversation. And as you can probably see, really the only connection between sewing and fashion history in this initial iteration of the costurero histórico was that we would talk about fashion history as we were making stitches of different kinds. But this showed me several insights of the potential of costureros históricos, especially because, well, I think I didn't mention this was all in Spanish, and most of the participants were in Latin America and based in Latin America, or Latin American and based in Latin America. So during our discussions, a lot of questions came about fashion history that had to do with maybe like redressing the canon of fashion history. There were many myths actually that we started to question there. And then there were also questions that I just couldn't answer because we didn't have information. So that to me opened new ideas about the importance of teaching fashion history from a Latin American perspective, especially to a Latin American public. And then the other, or audience. And then the other thing was even terminology. Sometimes we all knew terms in English or in French, for example, but we didn't know how to say them in Spanish. So even that already was an insight for me. Like, we need to push this a little bit more when it comes to creating knowledge and exchanging knowledge in Spanish. And that has actually turned out to be very, very useful for the following iterations of the costurero histórico. So following those, or maybe more or less at the same time of those initial costureros históricos, I was also, again, still in Virginia, still trying to figure out what to do with my research. And I was thankfully living just across the street from Colonial Williamsburg. So I started engaging more and more with their recreation practices. And I actually was able to take some classes with Sarah Woodyard to start learning the more properly historical recreation side of things. And I started also, as I experimented with this is the first shift I made, for example. And as I was doing this, I was also using this to show the people in the costureros históricos how their embroidery stitches kind of matched these other stitches that we have in clothes. And I started kind of bringing together the two worlds into those costureros históricos. And this helped me to give shape to a second iteration of the costurero histórico, which I unfortunately don't have any photos of them, but they occurred at Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, and thanks to Dr. Olga Acosta, whom I mentioned earlier, She has been teaching an undergraduate seminar in colonial art history for several years now at Universidad de los Andes, and that seminar has like a parallel research group. That's basically all of the people in the university that are interested in colonial art and continue to research it, and it brings together master's students with undergraduate students and professors within the university. But then also a lot of the students who have graduated and have gone to pursue their like research careers elsewhere are still part of the seminar. So we are quite a tight-knit community. But the Costurero Histórico took place as part of the seminar rather than the research group. And so what we did was that a former student of the seminar, member of the research group, Ana Maria Orobio, and me, we kind of took the initial, and she was one of the participants of the initial like virtual Costureros Históricos. So we kind of brought that structure, reshaped it, and redesigned a second version of the Costurero Histórico. So what we did then was, for a couple of sessions dedicated to material culture in colonial art, we would introduce the students to certain or we call them recreative actions. So it's basically trying to bring them to the materiality of fashion and to understand the basics of sewing to better understand the paintings. And this is an example of one of the paintings that we were looking at. It's an 18th-century painting from Bogota, most likely by one of the most renowned painters of the Viceroyalty of New Granada. And so these actions include some things that are, I wouldn't call them necessarily recreation, but we would bring different types of textiles and materials for students to touch and look at and try to match them as much as we can with the paintings, of course, recognizing that we are bringing contemporary fabrics that are different from the fabrics that would have been worn by these people. But it does give them a different kind of sense of what they are looking at. And then we would also teach them how to sew some things. We would bring, we have very few recreations at this point, but we would bring the few things that we have to show them so that they get a better understanding, like a 3D understanding of the fashions that they're seeing mostly in paintings. And that's the other thing, I think, in Colombia. That's a very important part of doing research in colonial or colonial period fashion, and is that there aren't many garments that have survived, or even textiles that have survived. So I think this is even a methodology that can be used to conduct research to, I don't want to say replace, but to understand the materiality that's almost completely absent in this context. And so by talking with the students, we realized that they now know more about the labor intensity of making the textiles, of making the garments. We have insights, or they got new insights about the material literacy of the people that are, or that were involved in painting all of these representations of dry. So not just the painter, but also the wearers and the assistants and everyone else. And they also realized that it's very important for artists even to know or to have a very solid understanding of textiles and of other materials. So this is probably not new to any of us here, but to Olga, for example, who is an art historian that has been dealing with mostly religious painting for all of her life, she was mind blown with these new insights. And so she encouraged Ana Maria and me to go and design like a third iteration of the Costureros Históricos, now at the Colonial Museum in Bogota. So these workshops now became a different thing because we have the museum galleries, and they are not very large and also, of course, not very well lit. So it would have been very difficult to actually have people sewing in there. So what we did was first have an in-gallery tour, and this tour has actually changed because the museum galleries changed a little, and they, for example, had a special temporary exhibition last year, specifically on decorative arts and textiles. So that one was super helpful to bring people there to see the objects. But usually those objects are not on display, so we rely mostly on portraits. But anyway, the first part is usually a gallery tour where we focus on fashion and textiles. And then the second part is there's a patio in the center of the house on the first floor. And so we would go there, and that's where the sewing part takes place. And it's basically same thing that we did with the students in the university. We teach them some recreative actions where they touch things, they sew some things. And again, they're trying to get them to materialize, at least in their mind, the images that we are seeing. And I think, so some of the insights, or most of the insights from these workshops in the museum are similar to what the students had, but of course this is a more general public. And actually it's very interesting because a lot of the people that participate in those workshops in the museum, they sew or they make things, but they don't know the art historical side of it. So we get kind of the other part of the picture. And altogether, I think for me especially, all of these workshops have opened new questions, and they are usually questions that people ask me or ask Anna when we're teaching the workshops, and we're like, we actually don't know. So I think that a way of actually answering those questions might be through recreations, again, because there's little material information that we have about garments. So for example, we've been interested about this dress in particular, and we have had changing theories about it. So for example, at the very beginning of my PhD, I ventured to say that this textile was a silk brocade, mostly because that's what you see old textiles to be in Latin America from the period. They are usually in church settings, but I was like, it should be that, yes, like whatever. But the more I look at it and the more I look at how it is all like painted, I am now more inclined to think that it's actually a printed cotton, or probably painted cotton. And it makes a lot of sense to me now. So sometimes I look at the painting and I'm like, why did I even think it was a silk brocade? Like, where did I get that from? But again, it's a question to be answered, and I wonder if it can be answered by actually recreating the garment. The other thing is we don't know a lot about the back, and it seems like it's a fitted back gown, but what if, like, could it be a sack gown, and it's just because of how she's seating that the pleats are kind of not seen at all? So again, we have just questions about them. I also sometimes wonder if she's wearing stays underneath that, or if it's maybe a sort of like half-boned something, or if it's jumps. So again, and these are questions that I think could be answered perhaps by recreative practice. And then the other one that's very interesting for me is this ensemble, which actually brings together, I think, indigenous dress regimes with European dress regimes. So we see that she's wearing a sort of chemise or shift of some sort, but then she has this sort of sash wrapped around her waist. And then the skirt is also, it's called a faldellín. It's actually wrapped around her waist. And we can see it here a little bit because we can see this L. So it suggests that there's an overlap of the fabric. But then also from traveler chronicles of the time, that's where I learned that it's a faldellín and that it's actually supposed to be wrapped around the waist because they describe it as such. And the combination of the two, the wraparound skirt and the sash around it that holds it, is basically what Andean indigenous cultures had been wearing for centuries before the Spanish invasion. But the thing here is that you can see a little bit of maybe the shift under her abdomen, and then there's the apron thing on top that I think is a bag, but I'm not sure. But then, so the questions here are how all of the elements kind of go together. Like, what do they put first? It almost seems as if the sash is kind of under the skirt rather than over and holding it. So again, these are things that they probably don't require a lot of like high intensity recreations, but just like experimenting even with pieces of fabrics can help us resolve these questions and into the future, and perhaps even do demonstrations with the public. And so here I get to the last part, and it's how sewing circles and workshops and recreative practice can contribute to decolonizing fashion studies and fashion history. And this is just an initial maybe reflection or guess. So put very briefly, decolonizing is a never-ending process and an ongoing process that requires several things, but the top three that I take here are recognizing that much of the world that we live in has been shaped by colonization and colonial violence, address the devastating impact of colonialism to create a new, more equitable, ethical, and diverse world order, and then provide reparations, liberation, and sovereignty to people of color around the world. And I think from these initial experiments in Costureros Históricos, that's precisely what they do. So first, they help us overcome the individualistic nature of research and knowledge making proposed by Western cosmologies. And they lay the ground for a more relational way of researching and exchanging knowledge. And we can see this in the fact that, well, first I started teaching them and designed them, especially in the museum setting, with an undergraduate student, even as I was like a university professor. So that kind of horizontality is a different way of teaching. And then we were always open to what the people had to say and what the people had to teach us. So again, it's a more horizontal kind of hierarchy, or it tries to maybe like get rid of that hierarchy. And then there's also a group and collective process in there, and that relational kind of idea of exchange, or that relational way of exchanging knowledge, is a way in which many indigenous communities actually exchange knowledge and preserve knowledge. So Costureros Históricos, I think, bring that to the forefront. And then the last thing is that I think Costureros Históricos, because they are opening these new questions and they are actually leaving the space to answer those questions from a practice-based setting in Latin America, probably in Spanish as well, they are also, in a way, fighting against Eurocentric narratives of fashion history. They are fighting against myths and stereotypes, and they are giving us our sovereignty of creating our own fashion history and narrating it in different ways. So again, this is a process. These are some initial experiments. But I'm very much looking forward to seeing what we can do next. This is Ana. Those are two students who are actually now teaching or guiding the Costureros Históricos since I left, and Ana also left Colombia. So we're also kind of moving forward with them even if we are abroad. And Serena and I are also trying to find ways to continue doing this research. So stay tuned for more. Thank you.
So our final speaker on this panel is Elinor Camille-Wood, who is a freelance curator and works with museums across Yorkshire. She was previously curator for Calderdale Museums, where she opened a fashion gallery at Bankfield Museum and curated a programme of fashion and textile exhibitions, including the hugely successful Costumes from Gentleman Jack and Fashion in the Time of Anne Leicester, 1791 to 1840. And today, Elinor is going to be speaking about curating inspired the art of making historical dress. And okay.
Yeah, click on the arrows.
Lovely, thank you. So, like Serena said, I'm going to be chatting about Inspired, which is an exhibition that is currently on now, so you'll still get to see it. So, we knew we'd fail at the first hurdle. So, Bankfield Museum, has anybody been? One, yes. Oh, two! There you go, three. We're on a winner. So, Bankfield Museum is in Halifax in West Yorkshire. It is the former home of Sir Edward Ackroyd, who was a mill owner. Halifax has a great wealth of tradition of industrial heritage. And we decided that we want to open a fashion gallery.
there are 17,000 items of fashion items in the collection. The collection is not based on kind of high fashion, it's fashion of the people who lived in the area. So it's really, really interesting. And what we wanted to do with the Fashion Gallery is show that, but also collaborate with other people as well. We wanted to really show off our industrial heritage and look at what is happening now. So Gentleman Jack, hands up again. Who has seen Gentleman Jack? Oh, there you go, quite a few. So Gentleman Jack was a BBC TV programme. It was filmed at Shibden Hall, Calderdale Museums, which Bankfield Museum is of, has Shibden Hall, Bankfield Museum, Smith Art Gallery, and it was filmed completely there, Series 1. This kind of catapulted us onto a national stage. It was about Anne Lister, who lived at Shibden Hall, one of the first modern lesbians who married her partner, Anne Walker. And what you had in that programme was absolutely amazing costumes. 1830s, not a period we see that much on TV, one of my favourites. And from this, we really worked with the costume designer Tom Pye, and we also became the fashion store for the TV programme, which was brilliant. They didn't have anywhere else to put it, so we said, yes, please, we'll have it, and we're going to put it on display. We opened it, this was the first ever exhibition where we opened the door and people were queuing to get in. It was that popular. And what we were able to do was put it here while we had an Anne Lister festival on at Shibden Hall, so we encouraged people to go to both sites, which again for the museum was great. The costume designer Tom Pye, we worked with really closely. The costume that you see here on Sophie Rundle and Walker is actually, the fabric was created from a pattern book in our collection that Tom Pye came to see, that he loved, he scanned, sent away, got the fabric printed, and then created this costume. So it was that lovely relationship of people seeing things on screen and understanding them, and then coming to the museum and realising that actually this is all based in historical research. So from there, we were contacted by Jeff Horsley, and we were invited to apply to be part of a project that looked about how you exhibit fashion. You have a lot of fashion collections in small local run museums that people don't know how to display. People are scared of. You know, mounting a costume is quite a specialist art, and doing it well is even more specialist. And so we were successful in being part of this project. And from our point of view, it was really great to be able to then move forward the exhibitions that we previously had. We were riding on the wave of the Gentleman Jack, and it's about how do we now go from there? How do we now say to people, this is what, how you make these costumes that you've been wonderful and seeing on screen. The two other exhibitions that were part of it, you had Manchester Art Gallery, who's got this one still currently on Unpicking Couture, very different. So another Northern museum, but they had just had money to purchase a big couture collection. They were also running off the back of closing Platt Hall, where their collection was, and about how they now display the collection and what they're displaying it with. So this one, big budget exhibition, massive cases. We were looking at a lot less budget. Beecroft Art Gallery, they wanted to do something that was very community based. They had a big collection of drag costume, and they had a lot of drag performers who lived in the community, and they wanted to display that. So what did we want to do? We wanted to create something where we actually invited makers. We wanted to show off this whole community of people who make historical fashion, and people who make it at different levels. So it's, like I said, currently on at the moment. So we selected some makers. This was a difficult one. As you can imagine, loads of great makers. What we wanted to do was show different aspects of them, but we were also very limited on time because we were waiting on the funding from the project. And I would say also, Banfield Museum, in terms of staff, in the curatorial department at the time, there was me and one other person, and we were curating across multiple museums. So again, it was partly who have we worked with previously, who is available, who do we like, who do we, we're being very honest, who do we like and who do we know we can work with. So we picked these makers, and thankfully they all said yes. What we did with the makers was that we invited them for a day at Bankfield. We got out pieces from the collection that we knew that they would be interested in or that they came to ask for from us. We then gave them the brief of saying you have specific cases to fill. Whereas I didn't want to kind of narrow down their creativity, at the same time we were limited on what we could do, and also limited on insurance levels, what could be on open display and what could be on case display. So we start off with White Phantom. White Phantom is a corset maker, does lots of fantasy things. She was absolutely loving our corset collection and was directly influenced by the red corset that you see in the middle case here to create her red dragon, and then the centre white corset where she created her white angel. This was one of the things where I'd said to her, you've got a case, and then on the day she turned up with these two. So we went, oh, okay, right, fine, we're going to have to put the white one on open display. So again, it's that idea of always trying to be flexible with what people are after. We then had, we've got the Duke of Wellington's collection, so we've got a really big military collection, and we didn't want to shy away from that. There is a lot of people who are creating military costume, and one of the people that we wanted to work with was Graves Historical Uniforms, who had come to us prior and had done a lot of research on our costumes. This is an exact replica of one from our collection. And then we had Gabby Monet, who was really interested in recreating dresses from museum collections. And the centre dress here, you'll see in a further slide, is a replica of one from our collection, which is just too delicate to put on display. So she was able to investigate it, take patterns from it, but also make it so that she could wear it as well. Then we had the lovely Serenas. This gave us the opportunity to get out pieces from our collection that would complement theirs. We also have been trying to build up a collection of wigs to go with our mannequins to make them more realistic. So this was the second wig that we actually commissioned and purchased. This is based on Queen Charlotte from one of her portraits. And again, we have certain wigs in the collection that are period, but they're too delicate, they couldn't go out on display. Then we also looked at people who are doing costume for commercial. So House of Foxy is a commercial company based in Elland, very near to Halifax. She employs local people, and she was driven to create fashion both for herself but also for this growing World War I and II replica festivals that go on in the local area. So the green and the blue dress, the green dress is from our collection, and she was so struck by it that she then used that to kind of create the blue dress, which is part of her Christmas collection. And then in the images here, the first two red ones are replicas. The third one is a CC41 from our collection. Then the creamy brown jacket, again, our collection. But you can you wouldn't know that particularly from that display. You wouldn't, if you were just looking at it without reading the labels. Then we also wanted to focus on menswear as well. In prior exhibitions, we'd had, well, as we all know, menswear isn't as collected as much as female wear. It isn't represented in our collection as much. So we were quite conscious that we wanted to include quite a bit in this exhibition. So we had Rob Cooper. Rob Cooper affectionately calls himself a stitch counter. So he's literally recreating stitch by stitch. And he spends a lot of time in our collection looking at examples. He's interested in Regency menswear. Then we also have Maple Dorham, again, who is creating using patterns, CC41 patterns to do 1930s and 1940s clothing, and we put those in with some from our collection. Then you had the costumes from Gentleman Jack. Again, they're in our store. We wanted to put them out and wanted people to see how you recreate fashion for TV. Whereas you've got Rob Cooper, who's stitch counting, you've got Tom Pye, who on these costumes, you've got Velcro fastenings, you've got buttons that shouldn't be where they should be. And then you've got Elinor Horton, who looks at costume in a different way, in that she wants to recreate it through drawing it. She does a lot of studying, a lot of work with the Bronte parsonage, and we previously worked with her displaying some of Charlotte Bronte's dresses. So that was an interesting thing for people to see, how you can investigate fashion in a different way. So in the exhibition, what we wanted to try and do is look at all the different interpretive practices, but then take the visitor on the journey of how do you go from seeing an object in a museum collection to wearing it yourself, recreating it, and then wearing it. So we started off with the blue dress that I showed you before that had been recreated. This is from the collection. We displayed it flat. This is called our coffin case, and, as we call it. And so the dress lay flat, it was opened up, you can see where the rips are in it, and we highlighted parts of it, almost kind of doing a forensic examination. We gave people magnifying glasses, we gave them tape measures so that they could then do their own investigation on it. Then in this part we had to have the dressing up. Everybody loves to do the dressing up. But what we also had was we did some pattern pieces so that you could understand draping on a form, and that you could make different things, so you could understand, well, if you put this here and this here, this is how you would get that shape. And that again proved very popular. Then we had drawing. This is a dress from our collection. This was something that we were put it this way, the museum manager had to be persuaded that it could go out on open display. The Manchester exhibition, we learnt a lot from that. They actually put a dress in the centre, then they put easels around it and no barriers. So in effect, the public could, if they went behind the easels, go right up to the dress. We weren't as brave, so we wanted to do that and allow people to get close, but equally we still had to have a barrier around it. The space is invigilated at times, so there are times where it's not invigilated. It's also upstairs on the top floor of the museum. So again, it could be some place where if people did want to do anything, it would be, you could. So we were conscious that we'd still have to put a barrier around it. We also created 2 films. So again, we wanted the people to hear the maker's voice. So we had a making historical fashion film, but then a film that was specifically about Tom Pye called Dressing Gentleman Jack. This was part of our legacy, and also one of the things that we wanted to do was we had a budget, so we thought, right, this is our chance to actually make something that we can use, and then if we do the long-term aim is to do a travelling exhibition with all the Gentleman Jack costumes, we can put that film with that. So again, because we're a council-run museum, because we have very limited budgets, we're always trying to find ways that we can make stuff stretch. Then one of the kind of curatorial approaches that we took was that the previous exhibition that had been in was very busy. It was one that had a lot of objects. And although certain people would like it, they've done a lot of reminiscing, it was one that people felt that there was a bit too much in there. So in this one, we wanted to strip it out a lot more. The big panel boards that you see at the back, they were done from the collection. Again, the idea of opening up the garment, seeing the label, understanding the construction of it. So these were placed around. We also took the approach that the maker's voice again needed to be heard. So the makers were asked all the same questions, and their panels, so rather than it being my voice telling the people, the audience, what the maker did, it was actually the maker talking to the audience, which I think worked really well. This was from the Manchester exhibition. This is where they actually put the process up. Again, this was something that we were quite, not myself, but the museum manager was quite hesitant to do. it's almost like in a museum setting, you want the audience to come in and not, you're creating a stage. You don't want people to understand the kind of the swan with the legs under the water. But with this one, we wanted people, and part of the project was actually getting people to understand what it takes to put on an exhibition of this scale. So we put our project plans in, we put our sketches, we put our process and our exhibition work in there, and actually it was really well received. One thing we didn't do, and again I think if we were braver, and partly because we were restricted by the council, was we didn't put any budgets, so we took those out. Because we're council run, you always get we could be putting that money into care homes. So that's always the contention. So that was quite a choice that our senior manager said we couldn't put anything about budgeting. So how was it received? Very good. People enjoyed it. People are still enjoying it now. It has been able to kind of take down some of the barriers that we put up previously. People liked to see how the exhibition has been done. One of the things that I think on reflection that we could do more of is because we were under the constraint of being very quick in our selecting of makers, although the makers are great, they don't necessarily reflect the local community as much as we would have liked. So we would want to put more of that in. Again, budget, we would love to do a whole kind of events programme around that. In the beginning, when we thought we had more money than we did, we were looking at doing a maker studio, putting that in there so that there could be a different maker each time. We could actually be creating something. I think what I didn't want to do with the exhibition is I didn't want it to be this stagnant thing that, oh, these makers made this and that's finished. Well, actually, no, they're not. They're making now and they're continually making. And what we also wanted people to be was to be inspired. And how can you get inspired? By having a go and a practice yourselves. So again, that's something that I think going forward with the next exhibition would definitely have to be in there as well. But I think overall it's been a success, and I hope for the makers, Serena can testify to this, it's been a good kind of shop window for them to show some of the practices that they do, and also to get people to understand that there is this growing community of people, and it's not just what we were finding as well is that the audiences are getting younger and younger, whereas our audience, especially at Shibden, we have the kind of older generation who come, whereas this exhibition we saw a lot more younger people and a lot more younger people who enjoy making coming, which was great for us. So that was a very quick run through. I didn't even get a sign from Serena, so I must be doing okay. Yeah. So yeah, if you have any questions or anything like that, I'd love to answer them. Thank you.
Don't sit down, Ellen.
Thank you very much for that, Elinor. I think that's
been a wonderful panel with lots of different examples of how powerful and useful collaboration and working together can be. If I can ask all of our speakers to pop back up. We've got about 20 minutes for questions. We've got lots of time. You all did very well with time. Thank you very much. Have we got any questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much. Amazing presentations. Lots of food for thought. Elinor, how much is still on show? I'm thinking of students and bringing them to see. I just didn't catch it. I wasn't quite switched on at the beginning. Sorry.
Okay, yeah. So the exhibition's still on.
Yeah.
So it's a whole top. Have you been to Bankfield?
No.
Okay, right. So it's the whole top floor of the museum.
Yeah.
So it's quite a big. The only issue is it's an old listed building. Accessibility wise, it is upstairs, but we try and put chairs so if there's anybody, so you've just got to.
It's still on.
It's still on now. Yeah, definitely. And it's. I would say if anybody hasn't been up to the north, or been up to Yorkshire, there is so much to see. And what I would also ask is, if you bring in students, I'm not there at the moment, but I do a lot of workshops where we get things out of the collection. The collection is very much at Bankfield about being used. We want people to come, we want people to, so I've done some lovely workshops where we've got, if you have particular interest, we've got, you can pretty much, if you say to me, I'm into I don't know, needlework or something very special. We've got an example of it, so we really want to get the collection out there and get it discovered.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. It was such an inspiring panel. I've got a slightly predictable question, I think, for Veronica and Rebecca, about when in the images of Ellen Terry and also the other actor wearing the costume, I know she's wearing a crown of roses, and I wondered, does that survive at all? Did you ever consider trying to remake that, or have you as much been written about it?
So I think it's a crown of orange blossom.
Yeah,
I think it's herbs, or it's blossom of some kind. I don't think the original survives. I would need to check with Susanna Mayer, who, if you ever need to research Ellen Terry's collections, is wonderful and very welcoming. But as far as I'm aware, it doesn't survive because most of the costumes are stored together. I say that most because there are a few props, and sometimes things like that get cast in the props column that are stored slightly separately on the property. And what I know about the costumes is from spending a lot of time in the little attic or artist studio where they're stored, so I could just rummage through those boxes. So I can't be certain, but I don't think it does.
And the other thing that's missing is the big amber necklace.
The big amber necklace is also missing. So it's an incomplete recreation. We wanted to capture the objects that we had, but you're right, if it does get to the stage, we might have to think about getting a blossom headdress and a big amber necklace.
Thank you again, echoing Zara, for such a wonderful, sort of diverse panel. Also perhaps slightly predictable for me. I have a question for Isabella and Marg. I was really struck sort of in the two objects that you picked to sort of juxtapose is this idea of something professional versus a learning process. And I was wondering from sort of each of you in your process of studying and then recreating and restoring these objects, to what degree you think about imperfection, and particularly, I guess, Marg, in the process of restoring these things, whether or not you're restoring the imperfections that were a part of the original object.
Yeah, good question. I guess for me, it was just really important that what I did blended in. And yeah, there would be imperfections. So as I'm working with these threads and seeing what was already there, it wasn't all perfect. So there were missing stitches. You can see where thread had previously broken and the stitch had just carried on. So I stitched it, and if the thread broke, it broke. I did not start again. I finished my thread and I just carried on because that's how it was done and that's how I did it. So that's kind of the way I approached it, I suppose, yeah.
I also have a question for Isabella and Marg, if that's okay, or sort of maybe one for each of you. I was wondering about how these objects were handled and kind of the experience of holding them, especially the Bible cover. And I was wondering if there are any sort of marks of repeated use or signs of how they were kind of touched. And I was also wondering about recording the conservation process and how you kind of recorded maybe for posterity, for future conservation efforts, which parts you reconstructed and what's original to the object.
Okay, so the first question was previous handling. So yes, so the damage on the Bible cover was mostly on the back. I guess, you know, that's on the back, it was touching table and hands. So if you're holding it, the back was damaged and the edges. I tried to handle both objects as little as possible. So I was really aware of the fragility, especially with the Bible, because it had so many loose threads on it. So I did as much as I could without actually touching, actually, if that makes sense. I did not wear gloves, so it was just as little as possible, but not wearing gloves so that I could actually conserve the threads that were loose. There was no way I could stitch with a curved needle using gloves. And basically I took so many photographs of both objects, back and front, inside and out, before I even touched what I was doing. Both of them had loose threads and missing parts, so everything that was not there was recorded. Everything I did was photographed, and I wrote notes pretty much about everything I did and what I used. And as I mentioned, anything that I added on can be removed. So
although they're secure, they are removable. So going forward, if for whatever reason what I made needs to be taken off, there is no problem, and there will be no damage, hopefully, to the original object.
I don't think I have anything to add. Other than when I got shared the drive of photos, there are like 250 photos of each one.
Yeah,
you were thorough.
Yes. Yes, that's true, actually.
Yeah, I have a question for Laura. So once you kind of finished the workshops and you had communities coming together, especially in person, I was wondering, I guess, of some of the results from it, I guess, that were more like emotional or kind of community binding that you saw happen in kind of the, I guess like the good results that came out of that and like what that looked like, apart from, I guess, like the really specific good academic things that came out of it, but kind of how it brought communities together as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of it actually, and there's a group of women especially that I love them. They have come to several workshops, and even if it's the same theme, same everything, they just love coming back. And they actually, it's a group of sewers, so they get together to sew every like month or so. And for one of the sessions that I was teaching, they decided to swap their own individual session and just come to the museum instead. And ever since then, they come back. So with them specifically, I've heard a lot of reflections about like their grandmothers or how everything was made by hand and now it isn't. A couple of them, they used to work in like lingerie manufacturers in the country when they were younger. And so one day, for example, we were trying to like unpack stays, and they're like, oh, it's the same as when you do this and that in a bra. And so they started talking about it, and then it got into talking about ideas of comfort and the body and like controlling the body or shaping the body and things like that. So I think there are, like, all of these leads to additional conversations and additional ideas and questions and everything. And again, there's a lot of knowledge exchange too. And within the knowledge exchange, I think it usually falls back to like family histories, oral histories, memories, things like that. And I think that's beautiful. And again, the fact that they come like back to the workshops all the time. And I think one of the reasons, I didn't mention this, but one of the reasons the museum is always open for like to these workshops is because the number of attendees is usually quite high. So we have had sometimes like 40 people attending these workshops, and that's not that usual. It's a very small museum. It's not that usual that they have so many people. So I think even that just shows that people are just, you know, eager to come and learn and talk and also share their knowledge. That's the other thing they love. And I also see, and especially when we have these experienced like needle workers in the crowd, usually when we are explaining something and someone doesn't get it, like they start helping one another and they start sharing their own knowledge. So even that, I think, is definitely a community building experience. Thank you.
I'm going to use Chair's privilege to ask a kind of related question that builds on Rachel's, that is to all of the speakers, and that's about this core idea of collaboration. And when we have this sort of intersection between making and collaboration, what is that bringing to the table? Particularly inspired by the fact that Rebecca and I, and Michelle Barker, and Brooke Wellborn, and Sarah have been, and Liz, and our apprentice, Liz Gernard, have been making a mantua for the last 2 days on campus all together, and that we're all used to making, but we're normally making by ourselves, and actually it alters that experience when you all come together to do it. So I just thought it'd be a nice opportunity to get a reflection from everybody about that intersection between collaboration and making a recreative practice and what that brings.
Can I just jump in on that? Actually, Michelle and I were talking about this morning, because we were sort of saying, we were being very thankful that Brooke had come and basically made the petticoat yesterday, because we did not get as far as we'd hoped, and we were talking about how
we are all used to working on our own, and actually when you start working, especially when you're literally in the same space, we had at one point 3 or 4 people sewing on the same garment on one table. I was like, Serena, just go and sit on the table, just do a table, sit cross-legged. How you have to kind of get used to each other and each other's ways of working, and actually that potentially could have been one of the reasons that slowed us down in the last few days, was because actually learning how different people behave. I think for our project it would have been virtually impossible.
It wouldn't happen without collaboration. We needed all those different minds to come together. I mean, we could not have got to the 12 stage without Janet spending hours of dedicated time staring at that skirt and being committed to finding the right way to map it and translate from original garment to another fabric to a 12. But I needed, like I said, someone with costume making specifically to come and look at what Janet had created, because if you hadn't made for the stage, some of the tricks of the trade wouldn't be known to you. And I have stitched before. I would never show anything I have stitched to someone I didn't trust. I am not a maker at all, and Semzi's conservation expertise was essential to figuring out how we could work with a garment which every time you touch it, something else falls off, because it had an adhesive treatment several decades ago that is now actually just crunching the silk to pieces. That was another challenge Janet had. She's like, how do I map and not touch, or if I have to touch, I can't move them.
And no cutting stitches.
Yes, and no cutting stitches, which is why the knot is literally a knotty problem. So it's not, our project wouldn't be possible without it.
But it's also a form of collaboration where we're very rarely in the same room together. So we have to actually have confidence that the other people, complete confidence in the people we're working with, that that they're doing what they say they're doing, or so it's that sort of thing.
It's faith and expertise to come.
That leads exactly into what I was thinking, which is about trust. So when it comes to this stuff, I never saw the casket or the Bible cover in real life. So a lot of it was the trust in your handling of it and your expertise, and the conversations we had about this object that I have only ever seen photos of. The artisan is a hop-in place to be, though, because you can just walk downstairs into the studio, and every day I see you working on something different, and you can tell me about the materials, and you can talk about the how it feels to touch this stuff, and what is falling apart and what is remaining stable. And I can say, oh, that I know this, I know the imagery here, I know that this comes from a workshop, and I know that at this museum it was handled like this. And I feel like all of the conversations we have are very fruitful, because it's a lot like, oh yeah, and that reminds me of this, and like, oh my god, what about this? And it gets really loud and excited and lots of hands. So we have the gift that you guys don't have of being in the same space. But there is a lot of confidence in each other, I think, and the trust that the other person knows what they're talking about and has the expertise to back them up.
I'd say that's absolutely true. I mean, before I met Isabella, I'd followed you on social media.
Thanks.
I'm sure a few people have. And so it's really exciting to meet you. And yes, the first time we met, it was almost like, oh, hi. And then we were in and we were looking, and you identified the maker of what I was working on.
Love
and then
that
I'm like,
casket.
oh, well, look at this. You need to see this. And it was immediate. We didn't know each other, but we were there talking about an item together as if we had worked together for years. And I think it just worked really well. So we do mutually kind of learn off each other hugely, and I really appreciate what you're giving me.
The feeling is so mutual.
Thank you.
There's a lot of love in the room.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is, for the collection, for Montfort's collection, we need collaboration. A museum collection can't just sit in boxes. It needs to be out, it needs to be seen, and it needs to be understood. And I think without collaboration, that can't happen. And as a museum and as a curator, what you're there to do is tell those stories of the objects, but you can only get so far. And I think without the expertise of what the people that we've seen today, without makers, then that museum collection doesn't become relevant. And in a time where we have such economic pressures on us, where museums are closing, where collections are being sold, that's even more important now. So I think collaboration is absolutely key, and without it, I don't think museums can survive, in my opinion.
Now, you you sort of answered the question previously as well. It was inspired by your answer, but if you can.
Yeah, well, no, I was thinking about trust actually, because I think, so especially when working, I mean, we're all accustomed in a way to hierarchies, and I think for us, one of the most interesting things to navigate is precisely that trust, and a little bit about authority as well, when co-teaching, especially with people at different stages in their career. So I remember when we designed the very first workshop with a student to go teach basically her fellow students. She had only taken that class the semester before. She was like, I can't. And I was like, oh, you can. Like, you've done a lot of research. You know this. She knows that portrait or the painting that I showed you. She knows it better than pretty much anyone else in the university. So it was, I think, well, I trusted her and I knew I trusted her. But it was also, I think, navigating her own sort of self-trust, and also even her trust of me or of Olga, the other professor. Like, why do we need to know more than you do just because we're professors, right? It could be like maybe you know more than we do about some things at least. And so, yeah, so I think I'm still reflecting about the trust in there, but then also the hierarchies and how we can bring them down through these collaborations. And then also, I already mentioned this, but I'm always struck with the people who attend the workshops that end up knowing much more than I do and actually inform a lot of my ongoing questions and research.
Yeah, and just to build on that, the idea of hierarchies, one of the things that I'm also very keen with this making project is to kind of showcase the amount that conservators and curators feed into academic research. Because we have to appear as experts and specialists, we don't intentionally erase the fact that actually the reason we know that is a curator ran upstairs and pulled out 50 boxes and found this tiny hidden thing and gave it to us on a tray of wonderfulness. Like, our research is founded on this collaborative expertise, and the reason this project is so exciting and these projects are so exciting is you end up with this massive super brain, because no one can be an expert in everything, but if you bring this team together, you become this, you know, like I said, this amazing project that can do something that needs all these different threads coming together. So I think you're raising really important debate. I see what you're saying.
Does anybody have any burning questions, or is everybody actually burning for lunch? Should we break for lunch? Yeah. Okay. Can we thank our speakers? So lunch will be back down in the original registration room, so down the stairs and then that way along the corridor to the